not just the big hits, but what we were researching and looking at in terms of the long-term consequences could be a fatal blow to the NFL. So they didn't like that. So, not sure if you really get what this is about.
The Way of Will John.
Welcome back to the Way of Will John podcast. We have with us some special guests today, Dr. Stern and Matthew Roebuck. What's going on, guys? Dr. Stern first, how are you?
I'm doing terrific, Will. Thank you very, very much. It's so cool to be on this. I'm psyched.
Awesome. Matt, how's it going?
It's going well. It's great. Again, this is exciting, as Dr. Stern just mentioned. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I know you're overseas right now, but I hope you had a nice time to think back and reflect, I guess, while you're over there. Not much Thanksgiving celebrations over there, but hopefully.
Let's get straight into it. So let me get the background for both of you guys. Dr. Stern, we'll start with you. If you could just give us your background and who you are and what you're doing, and then we'll take it from there.
Oh, how many hours do you have, Will? I am a professor of neurology, neurosurgery, and anatomy and neurobiology at Boston University School of Medicine. And I also am the director of clinical research for the BU Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center, or CTE Center. And so I've been a clinician and a clinical neuroscientist, researcher for too many decades at this point. But I primarily had been an Alzheimer's disease specialist and researcher. But around 12 years ago, I kind of shifted gears to focus on the long-term brain consequences of repetitive blows to the head in various sports and other activities, but predominantly in contact and collision sports. And so I studied neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease, but have been focusing now on this other neurodegenerative disease, this brain disease called CTE. And so I oversee all kinds of research studies having to do with that and work with colleagues all around the world to try to understand this stuff. Matt works with me in a crucial role for one of those research studies that Matt can talk about. But that's me. You know, I'm a soccer/football fan, and I was also an American football fan for all of my life until a few years ago when I just stopped watching. So have been unable to do it.
I don't mean to interrupt, but did you stop watching when you realized that Patrick Mahomes was on the Chiefs and that we would win the Super Bowl forever and ever again, and you didn't have to watch anymore because for the next 20 years, Chiefs are going to have everything?
Oh, that's really funny. Actually, the last time I watched a game in person was at the Super Bowl in Arizona, when my team, there was this team called the New England Patriots with this quarterback. I think he's maybe 20 years older than Mahomes.
Yeah.
But when we played the Seahawks, and that was the last game I watched.
Okay.
And here's the reason why. Because I was so excited about being there. So excited to be at the Super Bowl that year. But at the same time, I had a publication coming out that was showing that former American football players, professional football players, who started playing before age 12 had significantly worse cognitive, thinking, memory, behavioral, and mood problems later in life compared to those who started at age 12 and older. In other words, these pros who had been playing before their brains were fully developed and took a whole lot of hits, weren't doing that well later in life compared to the ones who started later. So here I just published this paper, and I had to do interviews while I was at the game, but not letting the interviewers know that I was at the game because it was a little hypocritical. And then I stepped back and I said, you know what? I know too many of these guys who aren't doing well. And I've spoken to too many of their wives, family members, loved ones who lost their former player, died. And we found this disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So all those things together led me to, number one, not being able to watch the game anymore. Number two, got me even more passionate to find some answers.
Wow. Incredibly interesting, Matt. I'm not sure if you have anything to add on that, but.
Yeah, it's always tough. I've done a couple of these together now with Dr. Stern, and I always say everything he just said, I am not, right? I'm not a scientist. I'm not a researcher. I'm not in academia. I came into this. I spent 20 years working in Major League Baseball in a couple of front offices. Started with the Red Sox, out in Seattle with the Mariners, and then the last 15 seasons down in Miami with the Marlins. And a series of circumstances brought me back to Boston. I met Dr. Stern, and they were looking for someone to recruit, and this is my role now, recruit for this HIT study, the Head Impact and Trauma Surveillance Study. We're looking to enroll 4,800 former football, tackle football, and soccer players age 40 and older who played at any level, youth only, high school, college, or professionally, male or female. And it was a moment of, and I guess I still am a American football fan, and I am a soccer fan. I'm a dad of two girls who play soccer, and it was this moment of kind of reflection for me to get into this and speaking with Dr. Stern and seeing things differently. And I had spent 20 years again working with athletes, kind of getting them, and kind of the drill, getting them to do anything off the field, community relations visits, hospital visits, corporate sponsorship appearances, media interviews. And it was a point in time where I stopped to say, now this is an opportunity through this study for me to give back to the athletes and really contribute to their health, I guess, is sort of the simple way to put it. But and when Dr. Stern, when Bob explained this study to me and what they were looking to do for it, it was right away, it hit on so many levels of why it would be a fit for me. But the most important thing for me, and after speaking with Dr. Stern, was when I went out and spoke to athletes, former players who played football, who played soccer, because I didn't want to just take Dr. Stern's word that this was important, right? I mean, with all due respect, the work they're doing under Bob and through his leadership at the BU CT Center is incredible work. The world's leading institute on this type of research. But I didn't want to just take his word for it. And, in almost immediately he hands me a letter from the great Bruce Murray talking. It was a letter written to the National Institutes of Health when they were looking for funding for this project. And Bruce wrote about how important this work was. And then he handed me another letter signed by 40 former U.S. women national team players and Michelle Akers and Abby Wambach and so many others. And I went out and I spoke through some series of network relationships to people like Alexi Lawless and Taylor Twellman, who's such a huge advocate for this type of work, and others who told me, no, this is real and this is important. And it's not just doctors and scientists who are looking and for me, wanted to make sure they weren't sort of poking in the wrong places, right? There wasn't this level of, no, go away and don't ruin our sport. And when they all spoke about how important this was because either they had concerns or their teammates had concerns or they were just really wanting answers, then I knew that this was the right place for me to be.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, in life, we all sometimes hide from problems that are so glaringly there. I know, is it a bad thing to mention the NFL? You guys, we can talk about the NFL and all that stuff. I don't know.
You can talk about the NFL. I'm not sure what else to say, but yeah, you can talk about it.
Okay. Because I mean, you never know. I don't know everybody's affiliation, obviously, with certain things.
We have no affiliation with the NFL. We don't get any funding from the NFL.
Sure.
In fact,
are they friends with you? Are they friendly with you?
Fund. We used to be very friendly with them.
Okay. So your results came out.
Well, you know what? Till our results came out, till I started to understand what the NFL, quote, concussion settlement was all about before it was approved by the courts in the U.S. And I wrote kind of an affidavit, a declaration to the court independently, just saying, hey, not sure if you really get what this is about, but I laid out some major problems with it. And that kind of had a stumbling block for the movement of the settlement, and they didn't like that. Okay. And so a few things related to what our research findings were, that we were looking at these repetitive subconcussive blows. I can talk about that later, but not just the big hits, but what we were researching and looking at in terms of the long-term consequences could be a fatal blow to the NFL. So they didn't like that. So I don't have any relationship with them at all anymore.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I find it's really interesting. So my cousin played for, I believe, 6 or 8 years in the NFL. He was, my positioning on he's an offensive lineman. Is he on offensive? Protecting the quarterback? Is that offensive lineman?
Yeah.
Yep. It makes sense, right? Yep. So huge guy, obviously, big guy. One of the players who's probably not, I would imagine, not taking as many, he's not out in open field. Or are you about to correct me on that? Is he still getting? Oh, please do tell me that.
Well, see, that's sort of how I felt up until a year ago and coming into this. And when I talked about, my perspectives changing now being involved in this work, I felt the same. These are not, when on a routine play, you don't think of any issues to the brain. Right. And
so please educate me. I'm here to learn.
All right. So here, how much does your cousin weigh?
He's got to be. I'm bad with this too, but like if I'm.
He's over 300 pounds. He has to be over 300 pounds.
He's got to be right there at least. Yeah. He's so tall. The guy's so tall. He's,
The linemen in the NFL and in most Division I collegiate American football teams are 300 or more pounds. They are also really good athletes, and they can move unbelievably quickly. Okay. So think of them lined up at the line of scrimmage, and you got these two guys wearing these helmets, and they're like 4 feet apart initially. And their first thing they do is they go like this, or maybe shoulder to shoulder, and their heads go like this. But imagine hitting their heads against each other. 300-pounders really quickly. So we all think that big plastic helmet with the face mask protects people. How can anyone get hurt if they're wearing that big contraption? And the bigger and better they become, the more we think that they are safe. But it's important to understand that this has to do with heading the ball as well in soccer. The brain is the consistency of like Jell-O mold. So, it stays together. It's hard-ish, but it moves. And it's surrounded by fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. And that's surrounded by that big rock thing up our skull. And that jello mold consistency of the brain has these long connections between all the cells, the neurons. And the neurons are all kind of on the very outside of the brain. This is what's called the cell bodies of the neurons. And they connect to other ones through these long axons, and these fibers, basically. So imagine you got these 300-pounders. Doesn't matter that they're wearing a helmet, because the force that happens when the helmets hit, maybe the person doesn't feel any pain, but the brain rapidly accelerates and decelerates inside that skull, stretching and shearing those neurons, those brain cells. And each time that happens, there's an injury of some type. Maybe very, very tiny and it's not going to do anything. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle and it's going to do something, but we have this great immune system in our bodies and our brains to come to the rescue and kind of help the injury go away. But if you keep hitting it over and over again, it overwhelms the system. And instead of the healthy way of recovering, there becomes this overwhelming response to injury. And you get injury after injury after injury without knowing that you're injured, without the symptoms of a concussion. So when you were saying before, well, he's just a lineman. He's not getting those big hits that someone, like a running back or a defensive back is going to get when, they're smashed and they're thrown to the ground. And then they get up and they're wobbly, like we've seen way too many times. Well, those are concussions, those symptomatic concussions when you see stars and you have a headache and you can't concentrate and you don't know which way to go and you have poor balance and you're feeling foggy. All those things after you get hit. That's what constitutes a concussion. Those are important. Whether it's in soccer or American football, those are important, and we can talk about that. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, what people aren't aware of is that those repetitive subconcussive blows that happen over and over again because the person's not aware that there's a problem. They don't know there's a problem.
Right.
Because it's not hurting. And because they don't have symptoms. And so they keep getting hit over and over and over again. It's those things, the overall kind of cumulative amount of those hits that are what leads to later life brain disease, neurodegenerative disease, dementia, memory impairment, problems with behavioral and emotional regulation, all these things later in life. Not from the big hits that lead to a concussion, but from the routine hits, like what happens to your cousin at the line of scrimmage over and over again, but also just every play of every game and every practice. What these guys of all positions may experience. And it also may be what happens in soccer with the repetitive blows to the head from the soccer ball. So I'm saying these things as if we know all the answers, but we don't. We know that those repetitive head impacts cause later life brain disease. We don't know how many. We don't know how big or severe they have to be, how many in a week, how many in a year, how many over life. We don't know what type of injuries they are. We don't know other critical factors, like is it only just pros? Is it only people who played at the college level? What about people who played soccer just up through youth or high school?
Right.
We don't know all of the answers that will lead us to do something to hopefully prevent problems later in life, and hopefully through our research create ways to treat these difficulties or prevent the brain changes.
I have too many questions that will never get answered in this.
Especially with my long answers. You'll never get these things.
You're presenting so many different avenues for me to go down, and I'm going to keep myself fairly narrow here. And before we go off on, maybe I have a few tangents that we'll get to at the end, but at least for this, is the goal to have, I can combine a couple questions. Here we go. So is the goal to have a metric that you would then be able to measure? Because with certainly a number of variables, I mean, we've got guys, obviously the commonality between them is crushing their heads, but one guy eats at McDonald's, one guy is a vegan, one guy meditates. There's a whole, a lot of things we can do to boost our cognitive function or to deteriorate it, right? So is the goal to just have this overarching one thing that we could just basically be like, oh, you're just over the edge, or you need to do, is that the goal of this? I mean, is that like the Holy Grail? That's my question, I guess.
Well, the Holy Grail would be for human beings to understand that our brains are the most precious thing in our bodies, and perhaps the most complex thing in the world. And that I'm not sure it makes sense for human beings to do things that hurt that precious organ in a way that we really weren't meant to do. Yeah, that's why it's surrounded by a skull. That's why it is up in our heads. So that Holy Grail means we need to be aware of that. That doesn't mean we have to stop at all activities. We need to be active. We need to have sports. We need to have team sports. We need to be athletic. We need to have competition. We just need to figure out what is it that leads some people, like you were saying, to have poor outcomes later in life, and other people to be resilient.
Mm-hmm.
And so the only way we can do that is through research, and to try to get lots of people involved in the research so we can study some of the variables that have an impact on later life brain changes, some of the variables that increase risk, and some of the variables that decrease risk. And then we can try to come up with some answer to what we can do to prevent later life problems from the activities that people love.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I was going to ask, and maybe it's jumping to the end of the conversation, but I'm too curious. What right now then is your solution? What's your give me your solution based on what you think, and then what's your best case scenario? How do you feel? Could we stop? Like you said we can't stop. Activity can't stop, and certainly the behemoth that is the NFL and youth sports and everything is connected, and soccer and
FIFA.
Yeah, FIFA. Yeah, of course. And they would be opposed to having anything stopping, their machine going. So what do you do?
Well, I think part of it is using common sense and doing research. The common sense has already been started. So, for example, in the US, there's no heading in soccer up until around age 11, and then it's slowly brought in. And so that's a major thing.
Mm.
The UK and in other European countries, there's movement now to also reduce or eliminate heading in kids. That's a starting point. I think it also makes sense until we have complete answers or complete interventions to treat or prevent these things. In American football, to I guess make a common sense decision of not having kids tackle until till their brains are starting to maybe develop a little bit more. Because I know all these amazing former players who never started to play until they were in high school. Or others who are saying, why would kids need to be tackling? Why can't they just learn the incredible athleticism of the sport? And, maybe bring in tackling later. In soccer, this is a big question. This is going to raise a lot of controversy, but it's just a question. Is heading a necessary part of soccer? As far as I know, there's no mention of heading in the big Bible of rules for international soccer. There's no mention of heading. It's just something that has occurred since the soccer balls became smaller, synthetic, and bouncier. Prior to the 1980s, 1990s, and then earlier, there were leather balls, larger than the current ones, that soaked up water. And they weren't really bouncy to begin with. So the heading wasn't a big part of the sport then. But once those balls became smaller, bouncier, lighter, it again, I think, provided a false sense of invincibility, that you can have a force to your head because, it doesn't throw you down to the ground. Soccer is the beautiful game. It's an incredible game. I mean, it's obviously, it is the game out there. But do we need to get our brains involved other than thinking, using it to make it the beautiful game? So that's kind of a philosophical type of answer to it. The scientific and medical answer is we need to do research. We need to find the answers. And that's where Matt comes in. Finding the answers. How do we do that?
That's exactly what I essentially was asking him, what's the solution and what's the best case scenario? And, that's kind of where he left it.
Right. Yeah. Well, as far as, the finding answers piece and being able to do the research, we need participants. We need people to enroll to do the research so we have meaningful data. In this study, the specific to what we're working on now, what I'm working on with Dr. Stern, the head impact and trauma surveillance study. Again, it's for anyone 40 or older who played soccer or tackle football at any point in their lives. So even if they only played at the youth level, played through high school, certainly college or professionally, it's an online survey, self-reported about your playing history, your medical history, some mood and behavior questions, some brain games, as we like to call them, sort of memory, find the card, matching card type of stuff, just some brain games. and it's all done online on your own time, on your own schedule. There's no doctor's visits or co-pays or health insurance or any of that needed. It's just go online, take our survey, answer our questions. And it's what is interesting to me is the people that we need approximately 600 from different bins, as we'll call them, 600 men who only played youth football, 600 men who only played up through high school, up through college, and then up through professional. And then on the soccer side, 300 men who played at the youth level, 300 women who only played at the youth level. And so that group of kind of who only played at the youth level, and they're now 40 and older, you're talking about have stopped playing 30 plus years ago, right? And so they probably don't consider themselves a former athlete at this point, or at least not in that sport, maybe. But those are the people that we're having the most difficult time reaching and enrolling, particularly on the women's side. And you think probably my assumption is because 30 plus years ago, there was lack of opportunities for women to play soccer, girls to play soccer at that point. And so they're out there. I know they played. I know they exist. We only need 300 of them. But it's getting the word out to them that they can help drive and find answers, drive this work to find answers for parents, for soccer moms, if you will, for people to make those decisions of should they play or when is it safer to start playing and things like that. So it's been very eye-opening to me. I know Bob was talking a few minutes ago about waiting, particularly in the football side, the tackle football side, about waiting to start tackling. And I've said in a few conversations now that as far as I can think of, football, and I say this respectfully to the sport because I know it takes a ton of athletic ability to be successful in football, and I played through high school, and it ended because of my lack of athletic ability. But when I think about other sports, most of them require some level of, we'll say, thousands of hours of repetitive movements to master, whether it's juggling or dribbling a soccer ball or shooting free throws or shooting baskets or pitching in baseball or swinging a bat or go on and on, hockey sticks and lacrosse sticks and all the skills that are inherently required to be successful in repetitive practice of that sport. But when I think about tackle football, aside from maybe a quarterback, right, is there anything that requires this constant repetitive practice of consistently doing it over and over again to be successful at it, right? And so I'd say you can be an athlete, 8, 10, 12, 14 years old, go out and play multiple sports. There's this whole movement of conversation now about multi-sport athletes, but you certainly don't need to start tackling, blocking, hitting each other to go and be successful. And the list of, as Bob was mentioning earlier, the list of players who have gone on to be literal Hall of Famers in tackle football who didn't start playing until high school is long. I mean, it's an impressive list of former football players and still some current who are destined to be in the Hall of Fame who didn't start blocking, tackling, hitting, or playing the game even until high school. And so there isn't that need to pad them up or put the pads on at such a young age.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Just because, number one, going back to the solution, the very first one being heading, is it going to be possible? I cannot imagine the riots, the discussion in the room across trying to even suggest something that is almost going to seem sacrilegious to the populace within the sport of football, of world football.
But there is a conversation. Sorry to interrupt you. There is at least conversation, certainly in the UK and in England in the Premier League. Mm-hmm. And when I see quotes and articles coming out about their efforts to restrict heading, and this past summer they did a game, a header-free game, just to sort of see what it looks like. And again, and I say this with all due respect to, soccer in our country in the States, if they're at least having those conversations in the UK, in the Premier League, who are we to not have them here in the US to sort of follow suit, right? And I'm not saying, and I'm not advocating for it because I don't know the answers, right? But I think you can at least have the conversation of if there's things we can do now to focus on safety and to protect players. And I'll steal a line, from Bob, from Dr. Stern, that, research is indicating there are problems. And so what can we do now to prevent those problems or limit those problems? And so when I see the leaders over in the Premier League and the FA talk about restricting heading, even all the way up through, not just at the youth levels, but all the way up through in training for their professionals over there, then it's certainly worth having that conversation, beyond.
I think what happens is there needs to be too often these major, well-known former players, whether soccer or American football, who die after having cognitive impairment, memory difficulties, or mood and behavior changes, and they die, and then their brains are examined and they're found to have this brain disease, CTE. And those make major headlines, and it's usually because it's well-known professional players. But the question then is it only those people who are impacted by this disease or other later life problems with the brain? Research shows that, people who just played up through college for American football have had CTE after they die associated with their major problems later in life. But now there's research coming out about soccer that is a bit concerning. So out of Scotland, there was this kind of landmark study that came out a couple years ago that looked at mortality rates among former Scottish professional soccer players, men. And it compared all of the former Scottish players who died with same age kind of other people in Scotland. And they found that the former players had something like a 3 to 10-fold increased risk of dying from a neurodegenerative disease. That, I think, sparked a lot of the interest in the UK. And that's why I think there's a lot of interest there. And I could go into all the research about, mortality rates that we've done, that other people have done. But the key thing is that we know there's a problem. We don't know the specifics of the problem. We know there's a problem with hitting your head over and over again. We know, especially in American football, that there's a pretty big problem. But there hasn't been enough research yet with enough people to understand the risks, the risk factors, the resilience factors, to really answer the questions about who and how much hitting and what ages, and is there a difference between tackle football and soccer? Is it the heading amounts in soccer? Is there a difference between the era of play that people played 30 years ago compared to people who played 50 years ago? Is it something having to do with gender and sex? Are there male-female differences? One of the big things that's gone on over the last many years is that there's been a lot of increased research on kind of neuro-related issues in former players and in active athletes, including soccer. But most research in these areas of brain and sport have been conducted on men.
Let's see.
We must include women. We must include people who usually do not participate or are asked to participate or know that there is research going on. We need to include in research people from all different types of backgrounds. We need to include people of color who often are not represented appropriately in research. And in order to do all this stuff, it means getting a lot of people involved in the research. And so we have this HITS study, we have this HITS study, the Head Impact and Trauma Surveillance Study, or HITSS. People can find out more about it at hits.org, hitss.org. And it's a study that only involves online assessments. People don't have to go to a medical center, and they don't have to get their heads in scanners or their blood drawn or anything like that. It's all online. Questionnaires about how much they played, what ages, what positions, but then also questions about medical history, social, economic type history, and then questionnaires about mood and behavior and emotion and cognitive functioning. And then there's brain games, these cognitive tests online. It only takes like 2.5 hours. And then we ask people to come back every year if they can. But the only way we can get the answers is to have a whole lot of people participate.
Mm-hmm.
And those 2.5 hours that he mentioned don't need to be done all in one sitting. You can do 15, 20 minutes today, come back and do another half an hour tomorrow or over the weekend when you have time. It's on your own schedule to get through. Again, it probably does take about 2 to 2.5 hours to do it start to finish, but it can be broken up into smaller 20, 15, 20, 30-minute clips.
Right.
And we're not looking for people who feel like they have problems. We're looking for anyone. People who have problems, people who don't have any problems, just to participate in this study. We have all kinds of other studies that we've been doing, that I've been leading, that include lots of brain scans, and PET scans, and spinal taps, and blood tests, and in-depth, in-person type of assessments. We also have all of our research looking at brains after people pass away. And my colleague, Dr. McKee, and her team, who looks at the brain tissue. But this study, this HITS project, to me is a gigantic one, because it will help us answer questions that we still have out there.
And it's interesting what you say about the backgrounds, because I was going to kind of touch on that. But when I was mentioning also the controversy for what is and what it would be, and it's interesting that the UK has taken it on, but in my head, I actually wasn't. And while they're at the forefront, obviously, and also because so much money flows through the EPL and they dominate, and then it's like we're talking about the NFL, they also dominate. There's a dichotomy, though, between the people talking and making the rules and the fans also as well. And so that's another issue, because when I'm thinking of the controversy, maybe there's not a big, the FA can field these sort of questions and do all this. And I can see how in the West also there would be less of an issue with, youth soccer in the US is something that almost everyone has memories from. And we are experimenting with that in the US, and it's still this ongoing thing, and it's constantly molding, and it's changing so much. And I can see where we can implement things there a whole ton, and how a lot of the parents, maybe now, because we're starting to get to the point where the parents now maybe grew up playing soccer, more so than obviously 30, 40 years ago, clearly. And so when I look at the dichotomy, I go, okay, Africa, South America, parts of Asia, I almost feel like they're just going to laugh at that idea. Fans now, maybe the people in the FA, people working for certainly, but I think as all great movements happen, it takes getting the masses also to a certain sense understanding. Okay, well, this is just not going to be. We just can't be. It's clear. Like, let's just not do this because and once that happens, obviously that there's this bubble network effect. And so anyway, I just wanted to mention that, but I'm curious, what about rugby?
Yeah, rugby is another issue. CTE, that brain disease, has been found in deceased former rugby players. There's also been a mortality study done on rugby players in Europe that found that former rugby players have increased risk of neurodegenerative disease when they die. We're learning more about rugby, but there hasn't been enough research focusing on rugby. Now there's starting to be. But yeah, that's another one of the key sports. You have to know that all of this started with boxers. And, with boxing, people think about punch drunk for that term. Another term for it was dementia pugilistica, or the dementia of boxers. That's where it all started around 100 years ago. And it makes sense to people, including fans or previous fans, that boxing involves brain injury. You knock someone out. That's the goal of the sport. And boxing has subsided in popular interest over the last 50 years or so. Once there was more and more understanding that, creating brain damage in boxers that we can see in this dementia, this memory difficulty, this changes in mood and behavior, those types of things in former boxers, that decreased the fans. We have to understand that punch drunk, that dementia pugilistica, is the same thing as CTE. That's where it all started. The symptoms start years or decades later, but the disease gets started early on. And that's the same thing as more well-known or common brain diseases like Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a slowly progressive brain disease that starts around 20, 25 years before the very first symptom. And then the symptoms start, and someone might have some complaints of having memory difficulties, but they're still doing okay. And then it gets worse because more brain tissue is involved in Alzheimer's disease, and more brain tissue gets damaged, and there's atrophy. And then the person has more complaints, symptoms. If they get tested, they can be really impaired, but they're still able to function in life. Then it gets worse and worse, and the person's unable to really function, to be independent. And that's when we call it dementia from Alzheimer's disease. That's what dementia is. Dementia is not the same thing as Alzheimer's disease. Dementia means having memory and other cognitive difficulties that get bad enough to have an impact on daily functioning, on independence. That's what dementia is. Dementia is not an illness or a disease. It's a syndrome that is the later part of many different brain diseases. So Alzheimer's disease starts 20, 30 years before the person has the very first symptoms, and then it slowly progresses with the person getting worse and worse, and then they have Alzheimer's disease dementia. Well, that's what we're looking at with another disease, this chronic traumatic encephalopathy, that also seems to start years or decades before the first symptoms. And it gets started by those repetitive head impacts. Alzheimer's disease, we don't know what starts it for sure. With CTE, at least we know the necessary ingredient that gets it turned on. And then later on in life, it gets worse and worse. And people can then have dementia later in the course of CTE. That doesn't mean they have Alzheimer's disease. It means they have memory and cognitive impairment that gets in the way of daily life from this other disease, CTE.
And I was going to touch on, because you said the contains the necessary ingredients. I wanted to play devil's advocate and say, is there any chance, is there any percentage, this is just out of curiosity and to always ask out there questions, is there any chance, not that there's a problem, not that there's something there, because I think most people can be clear that there's a problem in this subset of humans. Is there any chance that it's not the hitting? Is there any possible chance that it's not that it's something else, that it's a spinal injury, or I have no idea, something else in the body that is being affected, and the result is appearing in the brain? It's a crazy out there question, but I mean,
you know what? When it comes to these types of things, there is no such thing as a crazy question. Mm-hmm. The more we learn about the brain and brain diseases and disorders, the more complex it seems to all of us people who are scientists in this area. We think things might be simple, and then we learn about it and it's complex. So your question of, is there any chance that people who get this disease got it from something other than brain trauma?
Yes.
I'm never someone to say that there's 100% chance of anything, or that there's a 0% chance of anything. I wouldn't be a scientist if I kind of thought that way. It's all about testing hypotheses. But when we look at all the data and look at the brain and how the brain functions, you can't hit your foot over and over again and have problems with memory and mood and behavior, and looking at the brain be destroyed and seeing proteins accumulate. Doesn't come from hitting your foot. Could it be something else? Could it be fertilizer on the turf? Could it be lifestyle? Could it be use of steroids? Could it be who grows up in what type of condition early in life? Maybe those things have some impact, but they don't cause it. You have to have that necessary ingredient of these repetitive blows to the head to have these later life problems with the brain. Now, here's a good kind of analogy. Cigarette smoking and cancer, lung cancer. All right. I think most people would agree that smoking causes lung cancer. Okay. The thing with lung cancer is a lot of people get it who have never smoked.
Sure.
There's also a lot of people who have smoked tons and never get lung cancer. Some of those people might get emphysema. Some of them might have a heart attack. They might have other things from the smoking, but they might not get lung cancer. So we know that there's a cause effect with smoking and lung cancer, but not everyone gets lung cancer, and not everyone with lung cancer smoked. With CTE, everyone who's had CTE has had a history of the brain trauma. But not everyone who's hit their head tons gets the disease.
Sure. I would continue. I want us to close up, though, since we have one minute. And we'll link, obviously, to everything that you guys have mentioned. The study, I'm sure you guys have plenty of links and plenty of resources where we can send guys. So if you're listening to this, of course, in the show notes. And if you're looking at this or a clip, it's right down below in the description box. This is really cool. I appreciate you guys taking the time to actually talk and then to do the research. I obviously I'm aware that it's an uphill battle, clearly. And so you guys are definitely troopers for taking it on. But I just want to say thanks, obviously for taking the time to do this and to do what you're doing.
Thank you, Will, and your team for inviting us to do this with you. You are just awesome. And it's really an honor to be able to speak with you and to hopefully have your listeners and viewers take this on.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for having us, Will.